So bringing you this video from the office today, so mind the echo. This is going to be a little bit of a break from my how I would redesign classes for 5th edition. And I'm going to talk about something I haven't talked about in a while. I'm going to respond to a collection of videos by Saibrock of Saibrock Opinions and kind of give my 2 cents on this. So, apologies. So, in the first video, Saibrock talks about dedicated resources are not free. And in that episode of Saibrock Opinions, he explains that he was having a discussion with somebody about Paladin and how Paladin wasn't worth playing past 7th level. And when asked what kind of features does the Paladin get that are worth getting past 7th level, the person explained that the Oath of the Ancients Paladin or some other Paladin gets an ability later on that allows them to, once per day, basically, if they fall to 0 hit points, they can get back up with 1 hit point, which is worse Death Ward, because Death Ward saves you from instant death, but this Paladin ability does not. And they get it like 8 levels, 9 levels past when a spellcaster who would have the capacity to cast Death Ward would get Death Ward. So strictly playing a spellcaster is better because you spend less levels on the spellcaster to get the Death Ward spell, and on top of that, the effect is better, and the resource that the caster uses is generic because they can use it to cast Death Ward, or they can use it to cast a better spell. And he explains that generic resources like that, like spell slots, will always be better than dedicated resources unless the dedicated resource is reliable or is balanced around the fact that a spell would be able to do something similar, but also have the versatility of everything else. So the dedicated resource would have to be strong enough to warrant wanting to get the dedicated resource over the generic resource. So you'd have to sacrifice the versatility of the generic resource for the reliability of the dedicated resource. But then in another video, he explains that he doesn't like the notion that features just become spells. And that in the video he explains that features becoming spells, or that the whole meme of in 4th edition everybody just became a spellcaster because of the fact that everybody had powers and the powers acted like spells, everybody just became a spellcaster, so anything that the fighter did is a spell. Anything the barbarian did was a spell. And that how changing class mechanics into spells is not a good thing because you're taking a core identity of the class and making it into a mechanic that could be interacted with the rest of the mechanic even when it couldn't before. And the example that he gave was the Paladin in 1D&D's playtest, where the Divine Smite ability, became a spell, not something that used spell slots to give you more damage, but that the Divine Smite ability was taken off of the Paladin and was made into a spell called Divine Smite, with its own level requirement, its own spell slot usage, and had its own verbal, somatic, material, whatever. It was basically given the same treatment as any other spell. And he explained why this is an issue, where if the Paladin has a verbal component, or if it has a somatic component, the Paladin would not be able to cast their spells without a feat, because you cannot spellcast without a free hand. In addition, I would also like to add on to that if the Paladin Smite even is just a verbal component, they essentially can be shut down by the Silence spell, because if it's a verbal component and you can't speak, you can't cast a spell, meaning you can't Divine Smite. And if it has a material component, they have to spend money on those material components, or hand wave it by saying those don't exist. There's also the thing that since it's a spell now, it can be counterspelled, and it's affected by an anti-magic field. So He explains that changing features into spells, like the Paladin's Divine Smite or the Wizard's ability to copy spells into their spellbook, by turning those features into spells, you are making features that previously did not interact with the spellcasting mechanic, since it used generic spell slots, or no spell slots at all in the case of the wizard, to fuel an ability, and thus cannot be countered or affected by an anti-magic field because you were not casting a spell, you were using an ability of your class. He explains how that is not very good design, because if you change everything to a spell, everything interacts with everything, and thus nothing has any meaning. At least that's what I pulled from it. Here's my question, though. If dedicated features are never going to be as good as generic features like spells, but turning features into spells is a bad idea, then what should we do? Like, as game designers, what should you do to make dedicated resources like that viable in the face of generic resources that are more versatile, most likely stronger in some cases, and are more abundant than the dedicated resource? What do you do? Because if you make, in my eyes, this is how I see it. If you have something like spell slots, and you have a number of spell slots, let's say you have 10 spell slots, they could be used for any spell, but then you have another class that has 5 things that they could do, and then they have 5 dedicated resources that they could do for only a certain thing, then what do you do in that case? Because if you make the dedicated resource just as abundant as the generic resource, then at least in my eyes, granting a generic resource or granting a dedicated resource this same abundance as a generic resource, at least to me, invalidates the generic resource, because while the generic resource has more versatility, if you could have just as much resources but are really good at one specific thing, then why not just get the dedicated resource and be better at the one thing than having generic slots? But vice versa, if you keep it the same, where the spellcaster has 10 generic resources and the other class has 5 generic resources and then 5 dedicated resources to one specific thing, you end up with the same scenario where now the person that uses the 10 generic resources is just strictly better because they have more versatility. So what do? You can't turn their features into spells, because then that takes away the class features and thus makes the dedicated resource even more prevalent. So do you just give them everybody generic resources like they did in 4th edition, where everybody had at-will, encounter, and daily, and every class can use at-will, encounter, and daily powers, but each one got a different power, in which case everything, in a sense, becomes, I don't want to say monochromatic, not monochromatic, but monosystematic, because you're only using one system for everything, which is the exact same problem as using spells for everything. Because in 5th edition, changing the Paladin's Divine Smite or the ability to scribe spells into the Wizard's spellbook, making those into spells, is seen as a bad thing. But having a power in 4th edition that is the same as any other encounter power that you can get, where it has the same cooldown time, it may have a difference in what action you use, but if you have 2 encounter powers and they both are damaging encounter powers that affect an area, the only difference that you get is the activation requirement, and the specific additional effect that you get for the power. So it's monosystematic because you're only using one system. Your power falls into one of three categories, and then it falls into specific areas of area of effect, damage, area of effect crowd control, single target crowd control, single target damage, or utility. But utility is a separate thing. So utility is usually in the utility section. So generally, in the power system, you have damage and you have control. Sometimes you have damage and control, and sometimes you also have movement in there as well. But generally, it falls into the same two categories of it does damage and does an effect, or it controls and it does damage. Basically, it falls into the same thing. So, is it a good thing to have everything, all features or abilities, be monosystematic, or is it not? Because if we make, like how I've been suggesting, of making every single martial class have a different dedicated resource that only they use, and they use it for their specific maneuvers, and then you have spellcasters who use different maneuvers or spell slots or whatever, and they have their own system for it, that's a dichotomy. That is a binary system layout in which the two separate classes of the spellcasters and the marshals are now using two different systems. But in that dichotomy, the marshals, each of them are using a different kind of system, but they're separate from one another. And then on top of that, all of them are separated from the spellcasters, who all use a monosystematic way of progressing where they all have spells and they all have at-wills, encounters, and dailies. So is the way you design classes in the sense of features versus abilities, is it good to have that kind of dichotomy where you have martial characters or different characters have a different resource than other characters? Or is it good to have a monosystematic system where everybody uses the same system, it's just they interact with the system slightly differently than everything else? I don't know. I would love to have a discussion about this, but Saibrock, if you're watching, please hit me up. I'd love to talk about this because it would really help out.